She stood on the porch of the house she had painted with her own hands in the cold at 11:30 at night, and the key wouldn't turn, not because the lock was broken, because the locks had been changed. 2 days after her son became worth $300 million, Margaret Hayes was locked out of her own home. The porch light was on. Her porch light, the one she'd replaced the bulb in just 3 weeks ago, and she stood there in the dark like a stranger, like someone who had never belonged there at all. If you want to know how a mother's heart breaks in slow motion, stay with me. Like this video, drop your city in the comments and let me show you how far the story travels. The night it happened, I had a casserole in the oven. That detail shouldn't matter. But for some reason, every time I go back to that evening in my memory, and I go back more than I should, that's the first thing I see. The orange glow of the oven light through the little window in the door. The smell of chicken and rosemary, and the kind of warmth that makes a house feel lived in. I had set it to 3:50. I was going to eat at 7. I had a specific plan for that Tuesday evening. Casserole, a little television, maybe a phone call with my friend Denise if she wasn't too tired from her shift at the hospital. None of that happened. At 6:42, my son called me. Not to talk, not to celebrate, even though he had every reason to. He called me to tell me that some papers had been signed and that there were going to be some transition arrangements happening in the coming weeks and that I shouldn't be alarmed. I remember standing at the kitchen counter, still holding the dish towel I'd been using to wipe down the stovetop and thinking, transition arrangements. Since when did my son talk like a corporate memo? Ryan, I said slowly, what does that mean? It means things are changing, Mom. It's complicated. Daniel's handling it. Daniel, that name again. What is Daniel handling exactly? A pause, a long one. In that pause, I heard something I had never heard in my son's voice before. Not nervousness, but something closer to rehearsed distance, like he'd been coached on what to say and was now running through his lines. Everything's taken care of, he said. I'll explain more when things settle down. I love you. I gotta go. And he was gone. I stood there for a moment, phone in hand, the dish towel still folded over my arm. Then I finished wiping the counter, checked on the casserole, and tried to shake the strange cold feeling that had settled in the center of my chest. I told myself I was being paranoid. That was my first mistake. I need to go back. If you're going to understand what happened, what really happened, you need to know where it started. Because what happened on that Tuesday night didn't come out of nowhere. It was the end of a road that had been quietly built beneath my feet for months, maybe longer. And like most roads you don't know you're walking on, by the time you see it clearly, you're already too far down it to turn around. My son Ryan was born in the spring during a thunderstorm in a county hospital in rural Ohio that smelled like antiseptic and old carpet. I was 26 years old and I was alone. His father, a man whose name I will not say here because he doesn't deserve the space, had been gone for 4 months. Not dramatically gone. Not a fight, not an ultimatum. He just quietly stopped showing up until one day he stopped showing up permanently, and I had to reckon with the fact that I was going to do this by myself. And I did. God, I did. The first years were the hardest. I worked 2 jobs, cashier at a grocery store during the day, cleaning offices at night, and I raised Ryan in a 1-bedroom apartment where we shared a bed until he was old enough to sleep on the pull-out sofa I'd gotten from Goodwill. I read to him every night, not because anyone told me to, but because books were one thing I could give him for free. We went through library books the way some kids go through toys. He devoured them. By the time he was 7, he was reading things I could barely understand. He was brilliant. I knew it early. The kind of brilliant that's both a gift and a problem, because the world isn't always set up for kids who are 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. He got into trouble in school, not for being bad, but for being bored. He'd finish his work in 20 minutes and spend the rest of the class hour dismantling whatever was in front of him. Calculators, radios. Once, famously, the back panel of the school's ancient desktop computer which earned him a 3-day suspension and a meeting with a vice principal, who I'm convinced was personally offended by a 10-year-old who understood computers better than he did. I sat across from that vice principal and I kept my voice calm and professional, and I said, "My son is not a discipline problem. My son is bored. There's a difference." Then I drove home, sat in the car in the parking lot of our apartment complex and cried for about 15 minutes. Because I was exhausted, and because I was scared, and because I didn't know how to give him what he needed with what I had. But I figured it out. We always figured it out. When Ryan was 14, I saved up for 6 months and bought him a used laptop from a pawn shop on Route 9. It was an ugly little machine, scuffed along one edge, keyboard missing the apostrophe key, running an operating system that was already 2 generations outdated. He looked at it the way some kids look at a new bicycle, with complete, consuming joy. Within a week, he had rebuilt the operating system from scratch. Within a month, he had taught himself to code. By the time he was 16, he was doing freelance web work for local businesses and making more per hour than I did at either of my jobs. I remember the first check he got, $42 from a florist who wanted a website, and how he came home and held it out to me like it was treasure. "We're going to be okay, Mom," he said, 16 years old, standing in our kitchen in his socks, and he said it with the kind of certainty that made me believe him. I did my best not to cry in front of him. I didn't always succeed. The years moved differently after that. Ryan got a scholarship, partial, not full, because nothing was ever easy, to a technical university in Austin. I took out a loan to cover the rest. I didn't tell him how much. He didn't need that weight on him. He needed to focus. I drove him down in my 12-year-old Chevy, helped him unload his boxes into his dorm, and hugged him for a long time in the parking lot while the Texas heat pressed down on both of us. "Call me," I said. "Every week," he said. He called every week for about 2 years. Then things got busy. The calls got shorter. Weekly became bi-weekly, became monthly. I understood. I told myself I understood. I had watched enough of his life to know that Ryan, when he was in the middle of building something, disappeared into it like a person disappearing into a fog bank. It wasn't personal. It was just who he was. I told myself that for a long time. The company, Cypher Nest he called it, started in the back bedroom of a house Ryan rented with 2 friends in Austin. I know because I visited once, the summer after his 2nd year out of school. The room smelled like energy drinks and ambition and something burning in a circuit board. And every surface was covered in cables and printed code and sticky notes written in Ryan's cramped, hurried handwriting. He walked me through what they were building, and even with my limited technical vocabulary, I could see the logic of it. A cybersecurity platform, something about network threat detection and real-time encryption protocols. It sounded important. It sounded complicated. "It could be big, Mom," he told me, his eyes doing that thing they'd always done when he was genuinely excited, going very still and very bright at the same time, like a light that stops flickering because it's finally getting enough power. "How big?" I asked. He paused. Not for drama. Ryan didn't do drama then, but because he was trying to be accurate. "I don't know yet, but the technology is real. It works." "How much do you need?" He looked at me. "Mom, how much, Ryan?" He hesitated. Then, 40,000. Just to keep us going for another year. Get a real server set up, maybe hire 1 more person. "But I'm not asking you for that. I'm not. I had $38,000 in savings. It had taken me 11 years to build it. It was my emergency fund, my safety net, the money that stood between me and real vulnerability." And I looked at my son's face, at the certainty and the fear and the barely contained hope that lived there simultaneously. And I thought about the pawn shop laptop and the library books and the $42 check from the florist. "I have 38, I said. "I can get the other 2 from Denise." "Mom, no, absolutely not." "Ryan Hayes, you will sit down and let me finish talking." He sat down. I have $38,000. I have raised you alone for your entire life. I have worked 2 jobs and taken out loans and driven a car with a check engine light that's been on for 3 years, and I've done all of it because I believe in you. Not because I had to, because I chose to. You understand the difference?" He was quiet. "So here is what is going to happen. I'm going to give you this money, and you are going to build this thing. And if it fails, which it might, and that's okay, you are going to remember that I did this because I love you, not because I want anything in return. Are we clear?" He nodded. His eyes were wet. "Good," I said. "Now let's go find somewhere to eat that isn't this room." And boy, that investment, that $40,000 scraped from the marrow of everything I'd built, kept Cypher Nest alive through its worst year. Ryan told me that later, that without that money, they would have shut down in March, 4 months before they landed their first major client. But by the time Cypher Nest became something, I was already a figure from his origin story, not a presence in his life, a chapter in it. The growth was extraordinary. I watched it the way you watch your child grow, when you're busy, always slightly shocked by how much has changed since the last time you really looked. First it was a small regional contract, then a major one, then an acquisition offer from a Silicon Valley firm that Ryan turned down, which made the news, then a bigger offer, which he also turned down, then investors, then more employees, then a valuation I couldn't fully process when he told me. Through all of this, I stayed in Ohio, in the house I'd bought with the first loan I ever paid off on my own. 3 bedrooms, a back porch, a garden I'd been cultivating for 20 years. That house was my life, physically. It was where I had recovered from the worst years and built the better ones. Ryan had added his name to the deed when he started doing well. "Just so there's no question," he said. "It's yours, Mom. I'm just making it official." I didn't think much of that at the time. It seemed like love. I didn't know yet that paper love and real love are 2 very different things. The sale happened in February, $300 million. Cypher Nest was acquired by a major tech conglomerate, and my son's name was in the financial press. I saw it on my phone while I was in the garden, wearing my old work gloves, pulling up frost-dead plants to make room for spring planting. I called him immediately. He picked up on the 4th ring. "Ryan," I said, "I saw the news. Are you—" "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, Mom, it happened." "Are you happy?" A pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Yeah, it's a lot to process. There's a lot going on right now." Of course there is. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Mom." We hung up after 3 minutes. No plan to celebrate. No mention of coming home. Nothing. I went back to my garden and kept pulling up dead plants, and I told myself this was fine. He was overwhelmed. He needed time. This was a big moment, and big moments take adjustment. That was the second mistake. I kept making excuses when I should have been asking questions. I met Vanessa Cole for the first time at a dinner in March, about 6 weeks after the sale. Ryan had invited me to Austin, finally, and I had driven down because I didn't want to make a fuss about the 14-hour drive. Vanessa was already at the restaurant when I arrived. She stood to greet me with the kind of smile that's been calibrated for maximum warmth and contains none. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful. Polished, precise, deliberately presented. Her handshake was firm. Her eye contact was steady. She called me Margaret immediately, though I hadn't given her the opportunity to learn my name, which told me she'd either done research or Ryan had briefed her extensively. "Ryan talks about you constantly," she said. Ryan was looking at the menu when she said this, and he didn't look up to confirm it. Something shifted in my stomach, not alarm exactly. More like the feeling when the weather changes and your joints know it before your brain does. Dinner was stiff. Vanessa was polished, charming in the way that makes you feel like you're being managed rather than engaged with. She asked me questions about myself with the focused attention of someone who is very good at making people feel heard without actually listening to them. She talked about the transition period and Ryan's vision going forward, and making smart decisions in a new financial landscape. phrases that didn't quite fit together into anything meaningful, but sounded like they should. Ryan spoke less than I'd ever heard him speak. He deferred to Vanessa when he should have had opinions. He let her order the wine without consulting me, and when I mentioned an investment idea I'd read about, something small and simple, not meaningful, just making conversation, Vanessa tilted her head with patient condescension and said, "Those kinds of vehicles can be tricky without the right guidance. That's why Ryan and I have Daniel." Daniel. First time I heard the name. "Who is Daniel?" I asked. "Our financial advisor," Vanessa said. "He's exceptional. Absolute expert in asset protection, trust structures, wealth management. He's been instrumental in helping Ryan think about the long term." She said it the way you'd speak about a private doctor, with the hushed reverence of someone who has access to something exclusive. I looked at Ryan. He was cutting his steak. "Ryan," I said, "do I get to meet this Daniel?" "Eventually," he said. "There's a lot going on right now. There's a lot going on right now." It was becoming his answer to everything. I drove back to Ohio the next morning, alone. Ryan hugged me goodbye outside the hotel, not the restaurant, not his home, and the hug lasted about 3 seconds. Vanessa wasn't there. She'd gone ahead somewhere. I didn't ask where. On the highway, somewhere around the Tennessee border, I let myself cry. Not dramatically. Just a slow leak, the kind that comes when you've been holding something together through sheer force of will and your hands finally get tired. I cried because I didn't recognize my son's face at dinner, not his features. His features were the same, but the expression behind them, the careful blankness, the way he looked at Vanessa before he spoke, like checking his watch before answering a question about what time it is. I had never seen him look at anyone like that, like he needed permission. The calls became less frequent after that. When they happened, they were short. He started talking to me the way you talk to a landlord, politely, efficiently, with the goal of resolving the conversation as quickly as possible. Questions I asked got vague answers. Invitations I extended got non-committal responses. My friend Denise, who has known me for 30 years and has earned the right to say hard things, came over one Saturday in late April and sat across from me at my kitchen table and said, "Margaret, what's going on with Ryan?" "He's adjusting," I said. "To what?" "To all of it. The money, the change, the—" "Margaret," I stopped. "You've said that for 4 months," Denise said. "He's adjusting, he's busy, he's processing. You're making excuses for a grown man who has not called his mother back in 3 weeks. I'm giving him space." "You're not giving him space. You're shrinking yourself so he doesn't have to notice you." I opened my mouth to say something, and then I closed it again, because she was right, and I knew it, and hearing it said out loud in the middle of my own kitchen, in the house I'd fought for, in the life I'd built, it hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I didn't respond. I got up and made more coffee, because sometimes that's the only thing you can do with a truth that won't fit anywhere comfortable. Daniel Cross came to see me in May, not Ryan. Daniel. He showed up at my front door on a Wednesday afternoon with a leather portfolio under one arm and the precise, careful friendliness of someone who has been trained to be charming to people he needs something from. He was in his mid-40s, well dressed without being flashy, hair perfectly in place in the way that only happens when someone pays for it to look effortless. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I'm Daniel Cross. I believe Ryan's mentioned me." "He has," I said. I did not open the door wider. I was hoping we could have a conversation about some of the financial arrangements Ryan is implementing. As part of the broader estate planning, there are a few things that directly concern the property, and Ryan wanted someone to walk you through them. "Ryan wanted that," I said flatly. "That's right." His smile didn't change. "Then why isn't Ryan here?" A microsecond of recalibration behind his eyes. "Ryan is in meetings this week. He sends his apologies. He really wanted you to have all the information, which is why he sent me." I looked at this man on my porch. The leather portfolio. The careful posture. The smile that hadn't reached his eyes once in the 30 seconds I'd been looking at his face. "Mr. Cross," I said, "I appreciate you making the trip. but I don't sign anything or agree to anything without speaking to my son directly first. Of course, he said. Absolutely understandable. This is just a preliminary conversation. Then we can have it after I've talked to Ryan. I said it pleasantly, firmly, and I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a long time after that, listening to the sound of his car pulling out of my driveway. My heart was beating faster than it should have been for someone who had just politely turned away a visitor. Something was wrong. I had known it since dinner in Austin. I had felt it in the highway tears and the 3-second hugs and the way Ryan said there's a lot going on every time I asked a real question. I called Ryan immediately. It went to voicemail. I left a message, calm, specific, clear. Ryan, a man named Daniel Cross just came to my house to talk to me about the property. I need you to call me back tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. He didn't call back that night. He didn't call back the next day either. He called 3 days later on a Saturday morning. I was in the garden. He sounded distracted, like he was doing something else while we talked. Mom, sorry I missed your call. Ryan, why did Daniel Cross come to my house? He was just trying to keep you in the loop. That's not an answer. Why was your financial advisor at my front door talking to me about the property? A pause. We're doing some restructuring. Trust structures, asset protection. It's what you do when there's real money involved. Daniel's setting it up. And my house is involved in this restructuring. The house is on the trust, yeah. It's actually better for you that way. It's protected, legally speaking. Ryan, I stopped him. Are you listening to yourself? What? This is my house. My name is on that deed. I have lived here for 22 years. You don't restructure my house. You don't put my house in anything without asking me. Do you understand what I'm saying? Silence. Daniel says it's standard practice. I don't care what Daniel says. I hadn't raised my voice in years. The sound of it in the garden surprised me. I care what you say. I care what you think. I care whether you've sat down and actually thought about what you're agreeing to, or whether you're just signing things because someone with a nice portfolio told you it was standard practice. Mom, you're overreacting. Ryan James Hayes, I gave you $40,000 when you were 24 years old, and I had $38,000 to my name. Don't tell me I'm overreacting about my own house. Another silence. Longer. I'll have Daniel explain it better. He can walk you through everything. I don't want Daniel to walk me through anything. I want you to walk me through it. I'm really busy right now. I know, I said quietly. You're always really busy now. I hung up, sat down on my garden bench, stayed there for a while. The rosemary was coming in thick that year. I remember thinking it smelled like every spring I had survived. Mercy. The certified letter came in June. I opened it at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on, holding my coffee, completely unprepared. It was formal, legal language, dense. I had to read it 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. My name was on it, but so was something else, a trust, a specific legal entity with a name I didn't recognize, managed by an LLC I'd never heard of. And the letter was informing me, formally, and with appropriate legal notice, that ownership of the property, my property, the house I had bought and paid for and lived in and planted and painted, had been transferred into this trust structure effective 2 weeks prior. 2 weeks prior. The transfer had already happened, without my signature, without my agreement, without one single conversation in which I had been asked. I put the letter down, picked up my coffee, set it back down because my hands were not entirely steady. I called the number on the letter, got a paralegal who was polite and unhelpful, and who kept referring to the trustee's authority and the arrangements made by the primary beneficiary. I asked to speak to whoever was in charge. She said she would pass along my message. I called Ryan. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I called Denise and read her the letter over the phone, and she was silent for a moment, and then she said very quietly, "Margaret, you need a lawyer." "I need my son," I said. "I know," she said, "but right now, you need a lawyer more." I found Alan Burke through a referral from Denise's cousin, a real estate and estate attorney, 30 years of practice, an office that smelled like paper and old wood. He read the letter I brought him in about 4 minutes, asked me 7 or 8 specific questions, and then sat back in his chair and said something that I will not forget. "Mrs. Hayes, this document does not have your signature on it. I know that, and you did not authorize this transfer." "No." "Then this transfer may not be valid." He paused. "May not be. We need to look at the full trust structure, the chain of authorization, whether your son had legal standing to transfer property in which you held a co-ownership interest without your consent." He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Do you have any ownership stake in the company?" Finessed. I thought about it. Ryan gave me some shares when he started making money. He said it was his way of paying me back for the loan. I never thought much about it. "Do you have documentation?" "I have a folder at home with papers I should have paid more attention to," I said honestly. Burke nodded. "Find that folder." The night everything broke open was July 14th. I know the date because I wrote it in my journal. Something I'd started doing again after the certified letter, the way you document things when you sense that documentation might matter later. I had driven to Austin that afternoon, not to fight, not yet, just to see my son's face when I asked him directly, "Do you know what has been done? Did you choose this?" I arrived at the address I had for him, a condominium in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, and rang the buzzer 3 times. No answer. I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours, trying his phone, watching the building, feeling more like a stranger with every passing minute. Then, at 9:47 p.m., I drove to my own house, the house that was mine, that I had always come back to. The key didn't turn. I stood on the porch, in the dark, the porch light on, my porch light, the one with the slightly crooked fixture I'd always meant to fix. And the key would not turn because the locks were new. I tried it twice, 3 times. Then I sat down on the porch steps of my own home and I called Ryan one more time. This time, he picked up. He picked up on the second ring, and his voice, when I heard it, was not the voice of someone comfortable. It was the voice of someone scared. "Mom," he said, and something in how he said it, just that word, just my title, just that, stopped me cold. "Ryan," I said, "I'm sitting on my porch. My key doesn't work." A pause that lasted an entire lifetime. "What?" he said, and I knew. In the way you know things when you have raised someone from nothing, when you know every register of their voice, that he had not known. That whatever had been done, whatever had been arranged, he had not known all of it, which meant someone had, and it wasn't him. "Ryan," I said very quietly, "what have you signed?" He started talking, and the more he talked, the colder I got, not with anger, with clarity. He talked about Daniel and the trust structure and the documents he'd signed, not all at once, but over months, in the middle of other things, some electronically, some in offices where he was handed a stack of papers and told they were standard and everything was fine, and here was the pen. He talked about how Daniel and Vanessa had told him this was the best way to protect his assets. He talked about how it had all seemed reasonable at the time. He talked like someone who had been asleep and was waking up mid-fall. "Ryan," I interrupted, "where are your accounts?" "What?" "Log into your account right now while I'm on the phone." A pause, the sound of typing, then silence. A different kind of silence than before, the silence of someone looking at something that doesn't make sense. The silence of a person watching the floor dissolve beneath their feet. "Mom," he said, and his voice had changed completely. The rehearsed distance was gone. He sounded 24 again. He sounded like the boy in the kitchen with the $42 check. "Mom, I can't, the account, it's the balances." "I know," I said, even though I didn't know yet, not the specifics. I knew in the way you know a storm is coming, when you can feel it in your teeth. I was sitting on my porch steps, locked out of my house, and my son was on the other end of the phone, locked out of everything he'd built. And somewhere between us, a man named Daniel Cross was making very specific plans for a very specific morning flight. The porch light hummed above me. Moths circled it in the dark. I looked up at it for a moment, breathed, let the night air into my lungs. Then I said, "Ryan, sit down. I need you to listen to me very carefully. And I need you to find that folder I gave you 7 years ago, the one with your company's incorporation papers, because I believe you put my name on something, and I believe that something is about to matter very much." Ryan didn't sleep that night. I know, because I didn't either, and every time I checked my phone between 2 and 5 in the morning, there were new messages from him. Not long ones, just fragments. Things like, "I'm looking through everything," and "Daniel's not answering," and at 3:17 a.m., simply, "Mom, I think I made a very bad mistake." I was sitting in Denise's guest room by then. She'd driven to the parking lot of my own house at 10:30 at night and picked me up off the porch steps like I was a piece of luggage someone had left at the curb, and she hadn't said much on the drive over, which was the right call. Sometimes the most generous thing a person can do is not make you explain yourself while you're still bleeding. I slept maybe 90 minutes. Shallow, restless, the kind of sleep that doesn't reset anything, just puts a thin layer of quiet over everything that's screaming underneath. I woke at 6 to the sound of Denise's coffee maker and lay in the dark guest room, staring at the ceiling, running through everything I knew and everything I didn't. What I knew: the locks on my house had been changed. A trust had been formed without my explicit consent. My son had signed documents he hadn't fully read. A man named Daniel Cross had been systematically inserting himself between Ryan and every meaningful decision in his life for the better part of a year. What I didn't know: how deep it went, how much had been moved, whether any of it could be undone. What I suspected: that the thing I had felt in my gut since that dinner in Austin, that cold joint-age warning that something was fundamentally wrong, had been right, and that I had spent 5 months talking myself out of trusting it. I got up, went to the kitchen, poured myself coffee without asking, and sat across from Denise at her table while she looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been your friend long enough to know better than to say, "I told you so." "I need to call Alan Burke," I said. "I need to find that folder, and I need to talk to Ryan in person." "Okay," Denise said. "I'm not falling apart," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I know," she said, and she refilled my coffee without being asked. That was the morning everything shifted from passive to active, from something happening to me to something I was going to happen back to. It took me a few days to find my footing, but I found it. The folder was at Denise's house, actually. I had given it to her for safekeeping 3 years earlier, during a period when I was doing some renovation on my house and moving things around, and I'd asked her to hold on to it because it contained documents I didn't want damaged or lost. I had forgotten that, or rather, I had put it away in that part of my mind where you store things you believe you'll never need. It was a manila folder, thicker than I remembered, rubber banded and a little creased along one edge. I sat at Denise's dining room table with it and my reading glasses and a yellow legal pad, and I went through every page. Most of it was what I expected: early incorporation papers from Cy Finesse, some correspondence between Ryan and his first business attorney, a few documents I didn't fully understand but had kept anyway on the instinct that they mattered. And then near the back of the folder, behind a section of pages I had to unclip to access, a stock certificate, or rather a record of equity allocation. 5% of Cy Finesse allocated to Margaret A. Hayes, signed by Ryan D. Hayes, dated just over 7 years ago. I stared at it for a long time. I remembered when Ryan had given this to me. He'd come home for a weekend, one of the last times he'd come home just to come home, before things got complicated. And we'd sat at my kitchen table and he'd slid this paper across to me and said, "This is yours. It's not much right now, but I want you to have it." "What is it?" I'd asked. 5% of the company, a real stake, not symbolic. If this ever becomes something, you're part of it. I had put it in the folder. I had not thought about it again. I am not a person who thinks about percentages and valuations on a regular basis. I am a person who thinks about her garden and her friend Denise and whether the rain gutters need cleaning. But now I was thinking about it. Cypher had sold for $300 million. 5% of $300 million was $15 million. My hand was shaking slightly when I picked up my phone and called Alan Burke. Burke's response, when I explained what I'd found, was not dramatic. He was not a dramatic man. He said, "Bring it in today," and hung up. I was in his office by 11 o'clock, the folder open on his desk, the equity document in the center. He read it carefully, put it down, read it again, asked me 3 questions, which I answered. Then he leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingertips together and looked at me with the focused, neutral expression of a man who has spent 30 years translating complexity into plain language. If this allocation was properly recorded in Cypher corporate documents, he said, and if the acquisition was structured in a way that required all equity holders to be included, which is standard in a full acquisition, then you were owed compensation in that deal. And if I wasn't included, then either it was an oversight, which is possible but unlikely given the size of the transaction, or your equity was somehow absorbed without your knowledge, which raises significant legal questions. He paused. Either way, if you hold 5% of that company, legitimately documented, you have standing, real standing. Standing for what? I asked. To challenge what's been done to your property, to demand a full accounting of the trust structure, to request documentation of any asset transfers made in your name or involving your interests, and, depending on what we find, potentially much more. He looked at me. Mrs. Hayes, do you know who drew up the trust? Daniel Cross's firm, I assume. Do you have a name of the firm? He gave me a card the day he came to my house, I said. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe I keep everything. Burke almost smiled. That's good. That's very good. Can you find that card? Yes. Then I want you to send me a photo of it the moment you do. And Mrs. Hayes. He paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who knows they land differently when you're already hurting. I want you to let me do the next steps. Don't confront Daniel Cross. Don't threaten anyone. Don't post anything publicly. Just let me pull the thread. Okay, I said, I mean it. Let me do this quietly first. Loud comes later if we need it, I said okay again. And this time I meant it differently. Not just agreement, but the kind of surrender that happens when you hand something difficult to someone who knows how to carry it. I drove back to Denise's house, found the business card in the side pocket of my purse, photographed it, and sent it to Burke before I even took my coat off. Then I sat down and tried to figure out how to talk to my son. Egg. Ryan drove to Ohio 3 days after the night on the porch steps. He showed up at Denise's door at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, which told me he had driven through the night and slept somewhere along the way because there's no other way to cover that distance in that time, unless you're moving with real urgency. He looked like he hadn't shaved in days. His shirt was wrinkled in the specific way that happens when you wear something you slept in. He'd lost maybe 5 pounds since I'd last seen him in person, and his eyes had the slightly hollowed quality of someone who has been living on anxiety and bad coffee. He stood in Denise's doorway and looked at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. He was 32 years old. He was worth, or had been worth, an enormous amount of money. He had built something from nothing, from a back bedroom and second-hand equipment, and my $40,000 and years of his own relentless work. He had done something genuinely impressive. And standing in that doorway, he looked like a 12-year-old who had broken something and didn't know how to say it. Come in, I said. He came in. Denise appeared from the kitchen, looked at him once, looked at me and said, I'm going to the grocery store. I'll be an hour. And she left because she is the best person I know. Ryan and I sat at Denise's dining room table, and the folder was between us, and neither of us pretended it wasn't there. "Tell me what you know," I said. "All of it. Don't edit it. Don't soften it. Just tell me." He did. It came out unevenly, the way confessions do, not in order, doubling back on itself, occasionally interrupted by him rubbing his face or staring at the table. But I listened, and I didn't interrupt, and I let him get to the shape of it. The shape of it was this. After the acquisition closed, Daniel Cross had approached Ryan with what he called a comprehensive wealth protection strategy. Given the size of the payout, Daniel explained, the single most important thing Ryan could do was establish a trust structure that would protect his assets from taxes, litigation, and what Daniel repeatedly called family exposure risks. He said this last phrase with the delicate neutrality of someone who has been trained to say uncomfortable things comfortably, and Ryan, who was 24 when he met me standing at a pawn shop counter, who grew up watching me work 2 jobs and come home tired, who had never in his life had a reason to think the phrase family exposure risk could apply to the people who loved him, did not immediately hear what that phrase actually meant. He heard it as legal language, financial terminology, standard practice. He did not hear it as your mother is a liability we would like to neutralize. He kept saying it was protection, Ryan said. For me, for everything I'd built. He made it sound like if I didn't do it, I'd be taking a risk, like not setting up the trust was the dangerous choice. And Vanessa? Ryan was quiet for a moment. She agreed with him, he said finally. Every time I brought up any uncertainty, she'd say Daniel knew what he was doing and that I was overthinking it, and that the people who built real generational wealth made these moves early. He paused. She said it in that way she has, where it sounds like she's reassuring you, but you come away from the conversation feeling like you'd be an idiot not to agree. I had sat across from Vanessa Cole at a restaurant in Austin and felt exactly that mechanism working. The patient condescension dressed up as warmth, the implication that disagreement was a form of ignorance. "How many documents did you sign?" I asked. I'm not exactly sure, he said, and the discomfort on his face when he said it was painful to watch. There were a lot of them, different meetings, some electronically, some in person. Daniel would explain the gist and say the details were standard, and I trusted him. "Ryan," I said his name very carefully. "Do you understand what was in those documents?" He looked at his hands. "Not all of it, no. There are moments in parenting that don't have a script. Moments when your child, no matter how old they are, no matter what they've accomplished, is sitting in front of you having done something they shouldn't have, and you have to decide in real time whether to be angry or whether to be useful. Those two things are not always compatible. I chose useful. But I won't pretend the anger wasn't there." "Okay," I said, "here's what we're going to do. You're going to get me everything, every document you signed, every email from Daniel, every communication from Vanessa about the trust, everything. And you're going to come with me to meet my attorney." "Your attorney?" "Alan Burke, real estate and estate law, 30 years. I've already been talking to him." Something crossed Ryan's face. Something complicated. Embarrassment, relief, and a very particular species of shame that comes when you realize the person you underestimated was further ahead than you. "Mom," he started. "Don't," I said quietly. "Ryan, not right now. Right now, we work the problem. The other conversation we'll have when we have time for it." I looked at him steadily. "But we will have it." He nodded. "And one more thing." I reached into the folder and slid the equity document across the table toward him. "Do you remember this?" He looked at it. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, and then slowly the beginning of understanding. "The 5%, he said. "Is it real?" I asked. "Is it properly recorded?" "Yes," he said immediately. "I made sure I had the attorney register it. You're a shareholder of record." He looked up at me. "Were in Cipher Nest. The acquisition. Did Daniel know about it?" Ryan went very still. He would have, he said slowly. Anyone doing due diligence on the acquisition would have seen all shareholders of record. His voice was changing, flattening, going careful. He would have known exactly who held equity. He stopped. He would have known that I had standing, I said, as a shareholder. If anything was done improperly with company assets or with assets tied to the company, I would have legal grounds to challenge it. Ryan was staring at the equity document like it was a map he was only now learning to read. He never mentioned you in any of the trust conversations, Ryan said. Not once. He talked about protecting assets from general exposure, from potential claimants, he never said your name. His jaw tightened. Not once, Mom. He built the whole thing around keeping you out of the conversation. That landed the way it was meant to land. I let it sit between us for a moment, let him feel the full weight of what that meant. A man who was supposed to be protecting Ryan had spent months carefully engineering a situation in which I, the one person who actually loved Ryan without condition or agenda, was being systematically excluded, not accidentally, not as an oversight, as a strategy. Ryan put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands flat against his eyes, and he sat like that for a while. I didn't touch him. He needed to feel it, not because I wanted him to hurt, but because the only way through is through, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is not rescue them from the full experience of their own reckoning. We met with Alan Burke the following morning, the three of us, Ryan included. Ryan brought his laptop and the physical documents he'd been able to gather, and Burke asked him questions with the systematic patience of someone who has done this many times before and knows that rushing a witness gets you incomplete answers. The picture that emerged over 2 hours was not simple, but its shape was clear enough. Daniel Cross had established a trust, formerly called the Hayes Asset Protection Trust, which had the audacity to use Ryan's name in a document built to strip him, with himself and his LLC named as co-trustees alongside Ryan. The language was complex enough that a non-lawyer reading it quickly would not immediately see the implication that as co-trustee, Daniel held equal authority over trust decisions, including transfers, distributions, and asset management. Vanessa Cole was listed as a secondary beneficiary. Ryan had not caught this. He'd been told she was included for estate planning purposes, which was technically true in the same way that a knife is technically a kitchen tool. The property transfer to the trust, my house. When did that happen? I asked Burke. He looked at the documents Ryan had brought. Based on what I'm seeing, the transfer was recorded approximately 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks, while I was in my garden, while I was making casseroles, while I was telling myself I was being paranoid. Is it valid? I asked. That depends on several things, Burke said carefully. Your co-ownership interest in the property, depending on how the original deed was structured, may mean that your consent was required for any transfer. If it was required and not obtained, the transfer may be challengeable. He paused. Additionally, if your equity stake in Cypher Nest was not properly accounted for in the acquisition, if you were not compensated for your 5%, you have a separate and significant claim. Were she compensated? Ryan asked. Burke looked at him levelly. Were you aware that she held 5%? Yes. Did you instruct anyone handling the acquisition to include her in the shareholder distribution? Ryan went slightly pale. I assumed it would be automatic. She's a shareholder of record. I assumed. In major acquisitions, equity distributions go to the shareholders listed in the most current shareholder registry, depending on what registry Daniel's firm used. Depending on how the transaction was structured, Burke let the implication settle rather than completing the sentence. Ryan's face was doing something I hadn't seen it do in years. The particular expression of someone who is not just learning they made a mistake, but learning the specific shape and depth of it. Learning how much of it was not just carelessness, but design. He would have managed the registry, Ryan said very quietly. Daniel's team handled all the administrative documentation in the months before the acquisition closed. He said it like each word cost him something. If he controlled the registry, then he controlled who appeared on it, Burke finished. The room was quiet. I want to tell you something about that silence because it's important. It would have been easy in that moment to feel victorious, to feel vindicated, to look across the table at my son and let myself think, you see, you should have listened to me, you should have kept me in your life, this is what happens. I didn't feel any of that. What I felt was grief. Not for the house, not for the money, not even for the months of unanswered calls and 3-second hugs. And there's a lot going on right now. I felt grief for my son, for the particular loneliness of being a brilliant person who got outmaneuvered by someone smarter in a different way. For the fact that Ryan, who had been suspicious of everything since the age of 9, who had taken apart every machine he ever touched, to understand how it worked, that Ryan had let himself be taken apart by a man in a nice suit because he'd needed someone to tell him he was allowed to enjoy what he'd built. Because I think, underneath all of it, that was the real wound. Ryan had worked so hard for so long that by the time the money arrived, he didn't fully trust it. Didn't trust himself to manage it. And Daniel Cross had walked into that gap like water into a crack in concrete. Quiet, patient, certain. And Vanessa had made him feel like belonging somewhere elevated was the same thing as becoming someone elevated. Like the distance between him and where he came from was a measure of how far he'd traveled rather than a measure of what he'd abandoned. I understood it. I understood it in a way that made it hurt more, not less. Ryan, I said, when the silence had gone on long enough. He looked at me. His eyes were red at the rims. I need you to do something for me, I said. I need you to go through every account you have access to, or had access to, and write down the balances, not the trust accounts. Your personal accounts, your operational accounts, anything in your name directly. I already checked, he said. Last night, he stopped, cleared his throat. They're significantly lower than they should be. How significantly? I had access to approximately 40 million in liquid assets post-acquisition, he said, with the careful precision of someone reading from an internal spreadsheet. Right now, I can access less than 2 million. From 40. In the silence that followed, Burke was already writing something down. Were there transfers out of those accounts, Burke asked, automated ones, set up as part of the trust structure, supposedly for investment purposes? I have records of them, at least some of them. Ryan slid a folder across Burke's desk. These are the ones I can document. There may be others I can't see. Burke opened the folder, looked at the top page. His expression, which was normally the expression of a man who made it his profession not to react visibly, shifted very slightly. The transfer volume here is not small, he said. No, Ryan agreed. And these are going to, Burke traced a finger down the page, an LLC based in, he looked up. Are you familiar with Harfield Capital Management? That's Daniel's firm, Ryan said immediately. Then we have a problem, Burke said, and this time even his careful professional neutrality couldn't contain the edge in it. We have a significant problem, and I think we need to involve people beyond this office. He meant law enforcement. He didn't say it yet, but we all understood. The thing about realizing you've been robbed, slowly, methodically, over the course of months, by someone who smiled at you across meeting room tables, is that the anger doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves. And between the waves there is something colder and quieter. The recognition that you are going to have to fight, and that fighting is exhausting and hard and uncertain, and that you have to do it anyway. I was 61 years old. I had worked 2 jobs for most of my adult life. I had given everything I had to a son who had, through a combination of ambition and grief and inexperience and loneliness, let people walk him away from me. I was tired. Lord, I was tired. But I was also, for the first time in months, completely clear. Burke was already on the phone when Ryan and I stepped out into the hallway. Through the closed door, we could hear his voice, low, precise, using language that was beyond my vocabulary, but that had the distinctive cadence of someone who knows exactly who to call and what to say when they call them. Ryan and I stood in that hallway and didn't talk for a minute. Then he said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I looked at him. My son, 32 years old, in a wrinkled shirt, standing in a hallway outside a lawyer's office in Ohio, because everything he'd built was being unwound by a man he'd trusted more than me. "I know," I said. "I should have." "Ryan," I looked at him steadily. "I know. We'll get to all of it, but right now we have to focus." He nodded, jaw tight, trying to hold himself together. "One thing I need you to understand," I said. "This is going to get harder before it gets easier. What's coming, the investigation, the legal process, what happens when all of this becomes visible, it's going to be hard. And there will be moments when you want to cut a deal or walk away or settle for less because it feels like less of a fight. I need you to promise me you won't." He looked at me. "Why?" "Because Daniel Cross changed the locks on my house," I said, "and I will not let that be the last thing he does to this family." Something came back into Ryan's eyes then. Not the particular blankness that had been living there for months. Something older, something I recognized. The boy who looked at a pawn shop laptop like it was the most important thing in the world. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said back. Burke's door opened. He stepped into the hallway with his notepad and looked at both of us with the calm urgency of a man who has just set something in motion that cannot be stopped. "I've spoken to a colleague," he said. "Someone in financial fraud litigation. We have an appointment tomorrow morning." He paused. "In the meantime, Ryan, I need you to do nothing. No calls to Daniel. No calls to Vanessa. No communications of any kind that could be interpreted as confrontational. Do you understand?" "Yes," Ryan said. "Mrs. Hayes?" "Understood," I said. Burke nodded once, went back into his office. Ryan and I walked out into the afternoon together, the first time in months we had walked anywhere together, and the August heat hit us both at once. He squinted in the light. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder. "You hungry?" I asked. He looked at me, like the question surprised him, like he'd forgotten that ordinary things still happened, even in the middle of everything that wasn't. "Yeah," he said. "Actually, yeah." "There's a diner 3 blocks from here," I said. "Good coffee, decent pie." We walked the 3 blocks without talking much. We sat across from each other in a booth with sticky laminate menus and a waitress who called us both honey and brought water without being asked. Ryan ordered a BLT and ate half of it before he'd finished unfolding his napkin. I watched him eat, and I thought about the boy who used to eat cereal standing at the kitchen counter because we didn't have a table that year, just the counter and the 2 mismatched stools that I had kept even after we could afford better because they were part of who we'd been. I didn't say any of that. It wasn't the time. But I held on to it. I held on to all of it. Because here's something I've learned over 61 years of living in a body that has been tired and scared and proud and heartbroken. The things you hold on to are the things that hold you up when everything else falls. And somewhere across the city, in an office tower I'd never visited, in front of screens showing accounts that were rapidly being drained, a man named Daniel Cross was starting to understand that he had miscalculated. He had looked at my name on that equity document and seen an obstacle. He had not seen a mother. That was his mistake. The fraud attorney's name was Carol Simmons, and she was not what I expected. I had expected someone like Burke, measured, careful, the kind of professional who speaks in complete sentences and never raises their voice. Carol Simmons was all of those things, but she was also something else. She was the kind of person who made you feel, from the moment you sat down in her office, that she had been waiting for exactly this case and was quietly delighted it had arrived. She was in her early 50s, mixed race, with close-cropped grey hair. She clearly didn't bother to dye, and she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she put on and took off with the unconscious rhythm of someone thinking hard. Her office was organized chaos, stacks of files that looked haphazard from across the room, but that she could navigate with the precision of someone who knew exactly where every piece lived. She shook my hand first, then Ryan's, and then she sat down and looked at the documents Burke had faxed ahead and said, without preamble, "Tell me about Daniel Cross." Ryan talked for 40 minutes. Carol took notes in a shorthand I couldn't read, asked clarifying questions in the flat, rapid tone of someone keeping up with their own thinking, and didn't react to anything emotionally. When Ryan finished, she flipped back 2 pages in her notes and tapped one line with her pen. "Harfield Capital Management," she said. "You said Daniel's firm." "Yes." "How long have you been a client?" "Since March, about 2 months after the acquisition closed." "Did anyone refer him to you, or did he approach you?" Ryan hesitated. "He was introduced to me through a contact, a man named Sorensen, who I'd met at a conference. He said Daniel was exceptional with new money clients, that he specialized in tech sector wealth management." Ryan paused. I didn't think to question the referral. Carol wrote something down. "This Sorensen, do you have contact information for him? I can find it." "Find it today." She said it without looking up. "Before we go further, Mrs. Hayes." She turned to me with the same direct focus she'd been pointing at Ryan. "Your 5% equity stake. Walk me through when it was allocated, how, and whether you received any communication from anyone at Cyphernest or from the acquisition team regarding shareholder distributions." "Ryan allocated it 7 years ago," I said. "It was registered at the time by his then attorney. I have the documentation." I put the equity certificate on her desk. "As for the acquisition, I received nothing. No communication, no distribution, nothing." She looked at the certificate for a long moment, put her glasses on, read it, took her glasses off. "And this was properly filed with the corporate secretary at the time of issue?" "It was," Ryan said. "I had our attorney register it specifically. I wanted it to be real, not a gesture." "Do you know who handled your shareholder registry in the months before the acquisition?" The question landed on Ryan like a hand on a bruise. "Daniel's team handled administrative documentation," he said. "Starting in November, about 4 months before closing." Carol set her pen down very deliberately. It was the closest she came to a dramatic gesture, and in context it was enough. "So the person managing your shareholder registry was the same person who later became co-trustee of your assets?" "Yes." She picked her pen back up. "Okay," she said, and the way she said it, flat, final, already 3 steps ahead, told me we had something real. "Here's what I need from you both, and I need it in the next 48 hours. She gave Ryan a list that took nearly 5 minutes to recite from memory. Every document he'd signed since closing, every communication from Daniel and Vanessa pertaining to financial matters, log-in credentials for every financial account so her forensic team could review access history, the contact information for the acquisition's closing attorney, and the name of the firm that had handled the shareholder registry independently, if one existed, before Daniel's team took over." Then she turned to me. "For you, I need a copy of the original deed to your property, the co-ownership documentation, and any written or digital communication you had with Daniel Cross, including," she said, meeting my eyes, "whatever happened when he came to your door." "I have the card he gave me," I said, "and I remember the conversation exactly. I didn't let him in." Something like approval moved across her face. "Good, that matters." She paused. "Mrs. Hayes, I want to be straightforward with you about something." "Please," I said. "What you've described, the trust structure, the property transfer without your consent, the apparent omission of your equity from the acquisition distribution. If the evidence supports the picture you've painted, this is not a civil matter. This is fraud, possibly wire fraud, depending on how the transfers were executed, possibly conspiracy." She let that sit for a moment. That means at some point this becomes a matter for federal investigators, not just attorneys. Are you prepared for what that looks like? I looked at her steadily. I'm prepared for whatever it takes. She nodded once. Then let's get to work. The 48 hours that followed were the most exhausting of my life, and I have given birth without medication and worked a double shift the same week, so that is not nothing. Ryan didn't sleep. I'm not sure he ate much either. He had installed himself in Denise's spare bedroom on the pull-out sofa, which seemed fitting in a way neither of us acknowledged, and I could hear him on the phone and on his laptop through the wall at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. He was going through years of documents with the desperate focus of a man trying to reconstruct the blueprint of a fire after it's already burned. I helped where I could, which was less than I wanted. Some of it was technical in ways I couldn't navigate. Some of it was legally complex enough that I had to trust Burke and Carol to interpret what we were finding. What I could do, and what I did methodically at Denise's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold and then got replaced and went cold again, was organize. Every piece of paper, every email screenshot Ryan forwarded me, every document with a date and a signature, I sorted into a timeline. Chronological order, clear headings, the kind of thing that takes patience and spatial thinking rather than legal expertise. Ryan found me at it at midnight on the second night and stopped in the kitchen doorway. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, I said without looking up. He was quiet for a moment. You're good at that. You were always good at organizing things, making order out of things. I looked up then. He was leaning in the doorway in socks and a t-shirt, looking at my organized stacks of paper with an expression I recognized from when he was 9 years old and had just understood something that had been confusing him. Not satisfaction exactly. Something more like sorrow at understanding, late. Someone had to be, I said, not harshly, just true. He came and sat across from me at the table. Didn't say anything for a minute, watched me work. Then, I know I kept saying I was busy. Ryan, no, I need to say this. He pressed his hands flat on the table, the way he always did when he was thinking carefully. I kept saying I was busy, and I was, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that when I was around you, I remembered where I came from, and for a while, and I know how bad this sounds, for a while I didn't want to remember. I put my pen down. Vanessa used to say things, he continued, staring at the table. Not mean things, subtle things, like we'd be at an event and she'd mention something about how I'd grown, how I'd changed, like the person I used to be was a rough draft, and I let her say it. I let myself believe that distance was the same as progress. The kitchen was very quiet. She was wrong, I said. I know that now. Ryan. I waited until he looked at me. I need you to understand something. What Vanessa said to you about the rough draft, about distance being progress, that's not love. That's management. Real love doesn't ask you to become someone unrecognizable. It asks you to become more fully who you already are. He looked at me for a long moment. His jaw worked. I know, he said again, but this time it sounded different. Not like agreement, like grief. We sat there a while longer, the document spread between us, the house quiet around us. At some point, Denise's cat came in and sat on top of the stack of papers I'd just organized, and we both laughed. Genuinely startled laugh. The kind that happens when you've been wound so tight that any release feels like a surprise. I moved the cat. Ryan handed me the papers. We kept working. Carol called at 9 the following morning. I was on my second cup of coffee and Ryan was in the shower, and Burke was already patched into the call. We found something, Carol said, and her voice had that particular compression of controlled urgency. My forensic accountant worked through the night. I want to talk you through what we're looking at. What we were looking at was this. In the 18 months since Harfield Capital Management had entered Ryan's life, a total of approximately $38 million had moved through accounts associated with the Hayes Asset Protection Trust. Of that, approximately 6 million could be traced to identifiable investment vehicles, legitimate, documented, coverable. The remaining 32 million had moved through a series of layered transfers, each routed through a different LLC, each LLC registered in a different jurisdiction, some domestic, some offshore. The final destinations for most of it were 2 accounts in financial institutions that Carol named with the careful pronunciation of someone reading from a document. Offshore? I asked. The Cayman Islands and a specific account associated with a holding company in the Channel Islands, Carol said. The holding company lists no named officers. Its legal address is a mail forwarding service. Ryan had come out of the shower partway through this, standing in the kitchen doorway in a towel with wet hair, listening to Carol's voice coming through my phone's speaker. His face had gone to stone. Is there any way to recover it? I asked. Possibly, depending on how quickly we can get international asset freeze orders in place. That's why I'm calling now rather than waiting for a formal meeting. A pause. I've spoken with a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. They're interested. They've asked us to come in this afternoon. Ryan sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. There's something else, Carol said. We ran a background check on Daniel Cross, deeper than a standard search. Harfield Capital Management was incorporated 14 months ago. Before that, Daniel Cross operated under a different firm name in 2 other states. That firm was the subject of a civil complaint filed 3 years ago by a client who alleged unauthorized transfer of assets. She paused. The complaint was settled out of court, NDA attached. But the pattern is documented. I let that land. I let it fully land. He's done this before, I said. The civil record suggests a similar methodology, Carol said carefully. New money, new client, without financial management experience, a trust structure that shifts control, systematic asset movement. Ryan's hands were flat on the table and he was staring at them like he could see through them. Ryan, Carol said, I need to ask you directly. Did Vanessa Cole have any financial relationship with Daniel Cross prior to her relationship with you? The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. I don't know, Ryan said. Can you find out? Maybe. There might be something in the emails. His voice was careful in the way that means the thing you're avoiding saying is starting to be unavoidable. Look, she said, before this afternoon. He found it in 40 minutes. It wasn't hidden, which was the thing that made it almost worse. It was in a chain of emails that Ryan had been copied on and apparently skimmed without fully reading. The kind of thing you do when you're flooded with communication and trust the people you're corresponding with. The email chain was between Vanessa and a real estate company discussing investment properties. At the bottom of one message, copied in on a scheduling detail, was a name, D. Cross Harfield Capital. The timestamp was 14 months ago, 3 months before Ryan met Daniel. 2 months before Vanessa introduced him to the contact named Sorensen, who had referred Daniel. They had known each other first. Ryan showed me the chain without saying anything. He had printed it out and he set it on the table in front of me and stepped back like he needed distance from it. I read it again. The thing about a betrayal that comes in layers is that you almost become numb to each successive one. You think you've hit the floor, and then the floor opens. You've already absorbed the house, the accounts, the trust, the equity omission, and then you absorb this, that the woman your son had been in a relationship with had restructured his life around, had let reshape his identity, had been part of the mechanism from the beginning, not a bystander who got drawn in, an architect. Ryan, I said. Don't, he said quietly. I'm not going to say anything you don't already know. I know. He was standing at the window, looking out at Denise's backyard. The August morning was bright and ordinary. A bird was doing something in the hedge. I know what it means. What do you need right now? He turned from the window. His eyes were dry, which surprised me. Not because I expected him to cry. Ryan has never been a person who cries easily, but because of the steadiness in his face. A different kind of steadiness than the rehearsed blankness from the dinner in Austin. This was something else, something that comes after a person has been stripped of every comforting story they were telling themselves and has nothing left but the bare thing underneath. I need to get dressed, he said, and I need to get to Carol's office. Okay, I said. And Mom. He looked at me. I need you to come with me. I'll get my coat, I said. The FBI field office was not what I had imagined from television. It was an unremarkable building, unremarkable lobby, 2 agents in ordinary clothes who introduced themselves by last name only, a man named Ferraro and a woman named Park, and led us into a conference room that smelled like recycled air and weak coffee. Carol was already there, Burke joined by phone. Ryan and I sat side by side. Ferraro did most of the talking, which was mostly asking. He was methodical and unhurried, going through the same timeline we'd already built, asking Ryan to confirm dates and amounts, occasionally asking me to confirm details about the property and the equity stake. He had a flat affect that I couldn't read, not unfriendly, not friendly, just neutral in the professional way of someone who has learned not to tip their hand. Park was quieter but took notes with a speed that suggested she wasn't missing anything. At the end of Ryan's account, which took close to 90 minutes, Ferraro looked at his notes and said, Mr. Hayes, do you know Daniel Cross's current location? Ryan shook his head. He hasn't answered any contact since the account started showing anomalies. And Vanessa Cole? I haven't spoken to her in 4 days. Ferraro and Park exchanged a look that lasted approximately half a second. Then Ferraro wrote something on a separate page and put it face down. We'll be in touch within 24 hours, he said. In the meantime, Mr. Hayes, we're going to need you to not make contact with either of them. Not by phone, not by email, not through intermediaries. Understood, Ryan said. Mrs. Hayes. Ferraro turned to me. Your equity stake in Cypher Nest. Do you have the original documentation with you? I put the certificate on the table. He photographed it without picking it up. And you received no distribution notification from the acquisition closing? Nothing. He nodded slowly, didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I want to be clear with you. What you've brought us today is a serious matter. We're going to pursue it seriously. But federal investigations are not fast, and they require a kind of patience that is difficult when you're living inside the situation. He looked at me with the directness of someone deciding to be honest rather than reassuring. Can you manage that? I thought about 61 years of managing things. 2 jobs and a pull-out sofa and a pawn shop laptop and $40,000 and 12-hour drives and 3-second hugs and a key that wouldn't turn. Yes, I said, I can manage that. What I couldn't manage, it turned out, was the waiting with Grace. We drove back from the FBI office in Carol's car. She insisted on driving us, which I think was professional habit, wanting to debrief in a controlled environment. And she talked through next steps in the measured, competent way that I had come to rely on. And Ryan asked intelligent questions, and I sat in the back seat and tried to stay present and felt instead the first real wave of exhaustion hit me. Not the functional exhaustion of not sleeping, though that was there too. The deeper kind. The kind that arrives when adrenaline has been your fuel for too long. And the crisis shifts from acute to administrative, and suddenly your body realizes it's been running on emergency reserves for weeks. I was 61 years old. I was living out of a bag in Denise's guest room. I had no access to my house. 2. I had been through a federal interview and a legal intake, and the systematic dismantling of the story I had been telling myself about my son and my life for the past year. I was, quietly and without wanting to admit it, at the limit of what I could hold. Denise knew. She always knew. When we got back, she took one look at me in the entryway and said, Ryan, there's food in the fridge. Margaret, you're going to sit down. I'm fine, I said. Margaret, I sat down. She made me eat something. Soup, I think, or maybe it was pasta. I genuinely can't recall the specific food. And she sat across from me and didn't ask questions, which was the right call. And at some point I put my fork down and said, he could have just called me. Denise looked at me. Ryan, I said, any of it. If he had just called me and said, Mom, there's someone in my life I don't fully trust. What should I do? I would have helped him. That's all I ever wanted, to help him. I know, she said. Instead I stopped, pressed my lips together. Instead he let a stranger manage me like a problem. He was scared, Denise said quietly. I'm not excusing it, I'm just saying, he was scared of what the money meant, and he was scared of disappointing you, and he was scared of being found out as someone who didn't know what he was doing. And Vanessa gave him a story where none of that was his fault, because he was evolving past it. She paused. People believe the stories that let them off the hook. It's human. It hurt, I said. I know it did. I don't mean the house or the money. I gestured vaguely, unable to find a word big enough. I gave him everything, and he looked at everything I gave him and decided it was something to grow away from. Denise reached across the table and put her hand over mine. And then he drove 14 hours to sit in a lawyer's office with you. I looked at her. He came, she said simply. When it mattered, he came. I sat with that for a while. It didn't fix anything. It didn't undo the months or the locks or the letter in the mail or the nights I'd spent talking myself out of what I knew. But it was true, and sometimes truth is the only foothold you have. The call came 2 days later at 7:15 in the morning. It was Carol. Her voice had a different quality than it usually did. Not alarmed, but compressed in a way that told me something had moved fast. We have a development, she said. Are you and Ryan together? He's in the next room. Hold on. I knocked on the guest room door. Ryan appeared in 10 seconds, still half asleep, looking at me with the immediate alertness of someone whose nervous system had been on standby. Carol, I said, holding up the phone. He was awake instantly. I put it on speaker. Agents attempted to make contact with Daniel Cross this morning, Carol said. At his home address. He wasn't there. His car is gone. His personal phone went to a disconnected tone as of approximately 11 p.m. last night. Ryan's jaw set. They've issued a travel alert, Carol continued. His passport is flagged. If he attempts to leave the country by commercial airline, they'll know. A pause. However, there are other ways. His movements in the next 24 to 48 hours are critical. What about Vanessa? Ryan asked. Her phone is active. She's in Austin. They've been in contact with her. Another pause, this one slightly different. She's cooperating. The word landed between Ryan and me like something dropped from a height. Cooperating, Ryan repeated. She claimed she was unaware of the full scope of what Daniel was doing with the assets. She says she understood she was a beneficiary of the trust but believed it was legitimate estate planning. Whether that's true is, Carol chose her words carefully. Something investigators will determine, but she is talking. Ryan turned away from me and walked to the window. I watched his shoulders, the line of his back, the way he held himself in the particular way of someone absorbing something that they cannot fully absorb while remaining upright. Vanessa was cooperating, which meant Vanessa was protecting Vanessa, which she had always done and always would, which meant whatever she told the investigators would be shaped by whatever shielded her most effectively, which meant we still did not know, and might never fully know, where the line was between what she had orchestrated and what she had simply benefited from. I thought about her at that dinner in Austin, the calibrated warmth. The Ryan talks about you constantly that Ryan didn't confirm because he wasn't really talking about me anymore. The patient condescension that dressed itself up as guidance. I thought you built a life around managing people, and in the end you are managing federal agents. Good luck with that. I didn't say it out loud. What do we do now? I asked Carol. Now, she said, you let us work. The asset freeze motions are filed. The international request for the offshore accounts is in process. That takes time, but it's moving. Your property transfer challenge is filed in the county court. She paused. And we wait. For what? For Daniel Cross to make a mistake. She said it with the quiet certainty of someone who has seen enough of these situations to know that people who build things on lies are not ultimately careful people. They are gamblers dressed as architects. And gamblers eventually always take one bet too many. He already made one, I said. He did, Carol agreed. He thought I was someone he could manage, I said. He came to my house with a leather portfolio and a smile and thought that was enough. A beat of silence. Yeah, she said, and for the first time in all our interactions, I heard something like warmth in her voice. He definitely miscalculated that one. We hung up. Ryan was still at the window. The morning light was coming in at an angle across the floor, and I stood in it for a moment, feeling its specific weight. Not warmth exactly, not at 7:15 in August in Ohio, but something close. Presence. Ordinary, unearned, unconditional presence. Mom, Ryan said, without turning from the window. Yeah. The 50% chance they catch him before he gets out, he paused. Is that a lot or not a lot? I don't know, I said honestly, but we're going to act like it's enough. He turned, looked at me across Denise's small living room. Morning light on both of us. Okay, he said. And then his phone rang. Not Carol, not Burke. An unfamiliar number, local area code. Ryan looked at it, looked at me. Answer it, I said. He answered. I watched his face as he listened. I watched it go through 3 distinct changes. Confusion, then recognition, then something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. He said 3 words slowly. Who is this? And then he listened for a long time, and when he finally lowered the phone and looked at me, the color had changed in his face. That was someone from the closing attorney's office, he said. The attorney who handled the Cipher Nest acquisition. I waited. They found something, he said, in the closing documents, something that was added in a late amendment 3 days before the transaction closed, something about shareholder distributions. He stopped. Ryan? They want to meet, he said, today. They say there's a document with your name on it that they never sent you, that was never supposed to reach you. The room was very quiet. A document with my name on it, I repeated. A waiver, he said, signed with your name, waiving your shareholder distribution rights. The air went out of the room. Not my signature, my name. Not the same thing. Not the same thing at all. But someone had needed it to be. And someone had made it so. I sat down in Denise's armchair, the one with the slightly broken spring that I'd gotten used to working around, and I looked at my hands in my lap and I thought, so that's the bottom. That's the actual floor. Someone had forged my signature to cut me out of $15 million, and they had done it with such precision and such confidence that they had not worried even for a moment that it might be found. Until now. Call Carol, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Call her right now. Ryan was already dialing. Carol arrived at Denise's house in person 40 minutes after Ryan's call. She didn't send a paralegal, didn't say she'd meet us at the office. She just arrived with her leather bag and her reading glasses on their chain, and when I opened the door she looked at my face and said, "Good, you're steady. We need that right now." I didn't feel steady. But I had learned over the course of the previous 2 weeks that Carol Simmons, saying something with conviction, had a structural effect on the air in a room. She had the quality of a load-bearing wall. You didn't have to feel certain yourself if she was in the building. She sat at Denise's dining room table, which had become by this point a kind of unofficial war room, covered in organized stacks of documents I'd been maintaining. And she opened her bag and pulled out a printed copy of something she'd already received electronically from the closing attorney's office. The document was 2 pages, standard legal formatting, dense, with language designed to be navigated rather than read. But at the bottom of the second page, on the signature line designated for Margaret A. Hayes, was a signature. My name, my supposed handwriting. I looked at it for a long time. It was good. I'll give Daniel Cross, or whoever had executed this, that much. It was a competent forgery. The capital M, the looping A, the way the H in Hayes connected to the A. Someone had studied a genuine sample of my handwriting before producing this. It wasn't the rushed scrawl of someone who hadn't bothered. It was careful, practiced, deliberate, which made it worse, not better. "Can you confirm categorically that this is not your signature?" Carol asked. "I have never seen this document before in my life," I said. "I did not sign it. I was not contacted by anyone at the closing attorney's office before or during the acquisition." "And you have documentation of where you were in the 3-day window before closing?" I thought about it. I was home in Ohio. I had a dentist appointment that week, and I called Denise from my landline on the 14th, I think. She'd remember. From the kitchen, where she'd been pretending to make tea, Denise said, "I remember. We talked for almost an hour. You were complaining about the garden hose." Carol wrote something down. "Phone records and the dental appointment will help establish your presence in Ohio and the impossibility of an in-person signing if they try to claim this was signed at the closing." She looked up. "The more immediate question is who produced this and when. The closing attorney's office has confirmed they did not witness the signature. It was submitted electronically as a scanned document 3 days before closing. The scan came from an email address associated with," she paused, reading from her notes, "Harfield Capital Management." Ryan, who had been sitting very still since Carol arrived, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Daniel submitted a forged signature to the closing attorney," I said. "That is what the evidence suggests," Carol said, "which elevates this from financial fraud and unauthorized asset transfer into federal forgery and wire fraud territory. Submitting a falsified document electronically across state lines is a federal offense, regardless of the underlying fraud." She took her glasses off and put them back on. "This is the piece we needed." "Why?" I asked. "Because everything else, the trust structure, the asset transfers, the offshore accounts, those involve complex financial instruments that take time to prosecute and are defensible in layers. A sophisticated attorney can argue ambiguity in a trust document. It's harder to argue ambiguity about a signature that isn't yours on a document you never received." She looked at me. "This is clean, this is clear, and this is what federal prosecutors love." Ryan spoke for the first time since Carol sat down. "When did the closing attorney's office find it?" "An internal audit," Carol said. "Routine review of acquisition files." An associate noticed a discrepancy. The email submission came from Harfield's domain rather than from the signatory directly, which is technically irregular. She flagged it to a senior partner who looked at the full record, compared it against the existing shareholder registry irregularities that had been brought to their attention through our inquiries, and called your number. She looked at Ryan. "They're not happy. Their firm's name is on a closing that involved a forged document. They have significant liability exposure, which means they have significant motivation to cooperate." "So now everyone's cooperating," Ryan said, with a flatness that contained more than it said. "It tends to go that way," Carol said, not unkindly. "When the structure starts to crack, everyone tries to get out from under before it collapses on them." She paused. "Ferraro called me 20 minutes ago. They've confirmed Daniel Cross attempted to book a private charter flight from a small regional airport in Tennessee. The flight was flagged and blocked. His passport hit the system." She looked at both of us. "They expect to make contact with him within hours." The room went quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that happens when something you've been bracing for finally starts to actually arrive. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think if I tell you I felt triumphant, that would be a lie. And this story doesn't work if I lie about the inside parts. What I felt was something closer to tired relief. The relief you feel when you've been holding a very heavy thing and someone finally takes some of the weight. Not all of it, but some. Enough that you can adjust your grip. I did not feel like I was winning. I felt like the bleeding had slowed. Ryan, sitting across the table from me, looked like a person who had been in a car wreck and was only now, several hours later, starting to understand the specific inventory of what was broken. Not in shock anymore. Past shock into the harder thing, the accounting. Adding up the pieces and figuring out which ones were permanent damage and which ones could be repaired. Carol left us with next steps and a list of things she needed by end of day, and the assurance that she would call the moment she heard anything further. Denise saw her to the door, and then the house was quiet, and Ryan and I sat at that table covered in organized documents, and I could hear the refrigerator humming, and a lawn mower somewhere down the street doing something completely normal and indifferent to everything that had happened in this room. "He forged your signature," Ryan said. Not a question, not outrage, just the flat statement of someone installing a fact in its permanent place. "Yes." He stood in an office somewhere and looked at a piece of paper with your name on it that you never agreed to and submitted it as legally binding. "Yes." Ryan pressed both hands over his face and held them there for a moment. When he lowered them, his eyes were dry, but something in them had shifted. Some last residual softness, some remaining uncertainty about the full shape of what had been done to both of us was gone. What was underneath was not anger exactly, it was clarity, a particular kind of clarity that comes from seeing in the complete picture when for a long time you'd only been able to see pieces. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Okay. When you gave me the $40,000, you said you did it because you chose to, not because you had to." He looked at me. "Did you ever regret it?" I thought about the question seriously because he deserved a serious answer and not a reflexive one. "No," I said. "I regretted some of what came after, the distance, the calls that got shorter, the dinner in Austin." I paused. "But the money itself?" "No, because I wasn't giving you money. I was telling you that I believed in what you were building, and I did. I still do." "Even now?" "Ryan, what happened to the money wasn't about what you built. It was about people who saw what you built and wanted to take it." I held his gaze. "Those are completely different things." He nodded slowly. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were clear. "I should have protected you," he said, "from all of it. You gave me everything, and I let someone—" "Stop," I said it firmly but not harshly. "You don't get to make this into a story where you failed to protect me. I am not someone who needed protection. I needed my son to include me in his life, which is a different thing entirely." A pause. "And right now, what I need from you is not guilt. I need you to stay focused, because this isn't over, and we still have a lot of work to do." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he almost smiled. Not fully, not yet, but almost. The ghost of the boy with the $42 check. "You never change," he said. "I change plenty," I said. "I just don't change the parts that matter." The call from Carol came at 4:17 that afternoon. Ryan and I were both at the table when it happened. We had spent the intervening hours going through a secondary set of financial documents that Carol's forensic accountant had flagged, confirming transaction dates and matching them against Ryan's calendar to identify every moment he'd been told he was signing something routine. There were 11 such moments. 11 meetings where Daniel had set a stack of papers in front of my son and said the word standard practice and handed him a pen. My phone lit up. "Carol." I answered before the second ring. "He's in custody," she said. 3 words. I let them sit in my chest for a moment. "Where?" I asked. "Nashville, private airfield. He had a rental car, cash, and a bag packed for a long trip, a beat. Also a second passport, Canadian, under a different name." She paused. "He'd done this before, Mrs. Hayes. He had infrastructure for running." I looked at Ryan across the table. He was watching my face. "They have him," I said. Ryan closed his eyes, just for a second. Then he opened them and looked at the ceiling and exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to carry 6 weeks of something out with it. "What happens now?" I asked Carol. "Federal arraignment likely tomorrow. Asset freeze orders are being confirmed and extended." The offshore account requests have been elevated. Given the arrest, we should have responses from the Cayman institutions within 72 hours, and the Channel Islands account is being addressed through a parallel legal channel. Her voice was professional and efficient as always, but there was something underneath it, a warmth she didn't usually allow into her tone. I also heard from Burke about 90 minutes ago. The county court has issued a temporary order halting any further disposition of your property while the challenge is heard. The locks on your house cannot legally be changed again, and if the trust-appointed agent attempts to sell or transfer the property in the interim, there are now sanctions attached. She paused. You can go home, Mrs. Hayes. Not permanently, not yet. The challenge still needs to be fully adjudicated. But you can go home. I had not cried once during any of this. Not when the key wouldn't turn. Not in Denise's guest room. Not when I saw the forged signature with my name on it. I had held everything very carefully, the way you hold things when you cannot afford to drop them. I cried now, quietly, without drama. Just 2 or 3 tears that arrived without asking permission, the way they do when the thing you've been bracing against finally stops pressing and your body hasn't caught up yet. Ryan reached across the table and put his hand over mine. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Sometimes the moment doesn't need words. It needs 2 people who have been through something hard together to simply acknowledge, without language, that they are still in the same room. I went home the next morning. Ryan drove me. Neither of us suggested it. He just appeared at Denise's door at 8 a.m. with his car keys and said, "Ready?" And I picked up my bag, and that was that. The drive took 11 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock in a way I hadn't been since this started, as though ordinary time had returned and was worth tracking again. My house looked the same from the outside. Same porch. Same slightly crooked porch light fixture. Same rosemary coming in thick along the front walk. The locksmith Burke had arranged met us there. A serious young woman with a toolbox who had the locks rekeyed in 25 minutes while Ryan and I stood on the porch in the morning air. When she handed me the new key, I stood at the door for a moment. Ryan was a few feet behind me. I could feel him watching. I put the key in the lock, turned it. The door opened the way doors should open, clean, immediate, without resistance. I stood in my own doorway and looked at my own hallway, and the specific quality of light that comes through the kitchen window in the morning, and I breathed in the smell of a house that is yours. Not remarkable, not poetic, just the specific combination of wood and old coffee and the cedar thing I put in the closets, and whatever is coming in from the garden. "Mom," Ryan said behind me. "Give me a second," I said. He gave me the second, then I stepped inside. We spent the day doing practical things. I made a list of everything that needed checking. The casserole that had been in the oven the night this started had been turned off by someone. I was relieved to discover, because the alternative was unpleasant to consider. The mail had accumulated in ways I needed to sort. A few things had been moved in the house. Small things, a chair, a side table, in ways that suggested someone had been inside for purposes I didn't want to think about too carefully. I moved them back. Ryan fixed a gutter that had been slightly detached from the fascia board since spring. He didn't ask if he could. He just found my tools in the garage and got up on the ladder and did it. And I stood in the yard and watched and thought about the 12-year-old who had taken apart the school computer, and the 24-year-old who had looked at me across a kitchen table with a check for $42, and the 32-year-old on that ladder in his good clothes getting dirt on his shirt. People are not reducible to their worst decisions. This is something I believe deeply, even when it's inconvenient. In the late afternoon, Denise came over with a pot of something she'd made, and the 3 of us ate at my kitchen table for the first time in 2 months, and the conversation was not about the case or the fraud or Daniel Cross or Vanessa Cole. It was about ordinary things. Denise's sister, who was visiting from Florida, the state of my garden, something Ryan had read that he wanted to talk about, ordinary things. At one point, Denise said something that made Ryan laugh, a real laugh, startled out of him, the kind he hadn't managed in weeks. And I sat across from him and watched it happen and let myself, just for that moment, simply be grateful. The following weeks were a study in the particular patients Carol had warned us about. Federal investigations don't move like television. They move like continental drift, imperceptibly, until suddenly they don't. There were filings and counter-filings and motions and requests and responses to requests, and a vocabulary of legal procedure that I learned out of necessity rather than interest. Burke and Carol were in near constant communication, and they communicated with me every few days in language I had trained myself to follow even when it wanted to slip into jargon. Daniel Cross's arraignment produced charges that Carol walked us through carefully: wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery of a financial instrument, conspiracy to commit fraud, and, once the forensic accounting team finished their full analysis, money laundering. 7 counts total. His attorney, a man whose name I never bothered to remember, entered a not guilty plea with the flat confidence of someone being paid to maintain a position rather than someone who believed it. The asset freeze held. The offshore accounts were a slower process. International financial law moves at its own pace and answers to its own logic. But by the 3rd week after the arrest, both the Cayman and Channel Islands accounts had been provisionally frozen pending the investigation. The money wasn't recovered yet. Not all of it, maybe not all of it ever. That was the reality Carol had been honest with us about from the beginning, and I appreciated the honesty even when the reality was hard, but it was frozen, which meant it couldn't go further. Vanessa Cole reached a separate agreement with investigators that resulted in her cooperation being formalized. The details of that agreement were not shared with me, and Carol advised me not to think too hard about what it contained. Her value to the prosecution is what she knows about Daniel's methodology, Carol said. Whatever she gets in return for that, try to let it go. It's not your hill. I tried. I mostly succeeded. What I could not let go of so easily, and I want to be honest about this because I think it matters, was the question of how much Vanessa had known and when. Whether she had walked into my son's life as a deliberate instrument of this scheme, or whether she had started as something genuine and been corrupted along the way, or whether she had always been exactly what the evidence suggested. I didn't know. I still don't know, not fully. And not knowing is its own particular difficulty. It is hard to forgive something when you can't clearly identify what you're forgiving. I had to make peace with that uncertainty, with the fact that some things don't resolve into clear shapes, no matter how long you look at them. The property challenge was adjudicated 6 weeks after the temporary order. A county court hearing, Burke present, the trust's appointed legal representative present, the forged waiver submitted as evidence, my dental records, and phone records confirming my presence in Ohio during the relevant window, and a forensic handwriting analysis obtained at Carol's insistence that concluded the signature on the waiver document was not consistent with my known handwriting samples. The transfer was invalidated. My house was mine. It was, legally and officially, and with the full weight of a court order behind it, mine. Burke called me from outside the courthouse. He was not a man given to enthusiasm, and so when he said, "We won," in exactly the tone of voice he used to say everything, it took me a moment to process it. "The property?" I asked. "The property," he confirmed. "Full invalidation." The trust had no standing to effect the transfer given the forgery in the underlying documents. The court found it void from the moment it was recorded. A pause. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes." I was sitting in my kitchen, at my table, in my house. The rosemary was still coming in strong through the back door, which I'd left open to the September air. "Thank you, Alan," I said. I'd started calling him Alan somewhere around week 3. He hadn't objected. there's one more thing, he said. The shareholder distribution, the $15 million that should have been included in your acquisition payout. Carol has filed the civil claim formally. It will take time, but given the forgery finding, the legal foundation is solid. Another pause. You should see most of it, maybe all of it. It depends on what can be proven in terms of damages and what can be recovered from the frozen accounts. $15 million. I sat with that number for a moment. Tried to make it real. Couldn't entirely. Numbers that size have a way of staying abstract, no matter how many times you say them. What was not abstract was the $40,000 I had given my son at 24, and the 11 years it had taken me to save it, and the drive home through the Tennessee heat with wet eyes, and every library book, and every double shift, and every check engine light, and every single decision I had made alone to keep going. Alan, I said. Yes? I'll call Ryan. Has he? Ryan's response when I told him was not immediate. There was silence on the line for long enough that I said his name twice. Then he said, "The house is really yours?" "The house is really mine," I said. More silence. Then, "Mom, I need to tell you something." "Okay." "I talked to a therapist," he said, "yesterday for the first time. He said it the way you say something you've been holding for a while and are testing how it sounds out loud. I've been thinking about how I got here, not just Daniel and Vanessa. Before that, why I was susceptible to it, why I let someone build a wall between me and you, and told myself it was healthy growth." A pause. The therapist said something. She said the distance we put between ourselves and the people who know us most completely is often exactly the measure of how scared we are of being seen clearly. I was quiet for a moment. "That's a good therapist," I said. "Yeah." A sound that was almost a laugh. "Yeah, she is." "I'm glad," I said, and I meant it without reservation. "I'm going to be better," he said. "Not perfect. I know I can't just say that and have it mean something. It has to be the thing I do every day." "I know," I said. "I want to be in your life, Mom. Actually in it. Not as a line item or a liability or a managed relationship." His voice was uneven in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager trying to explain something he'd broken. "I want to eat dinner at your table and fix your gutters and call you when nothing's wrong." I looked out my back door at the garden, the rosemary, the late season tomatoes that needed attention, the sky doing something complicated with clouds that meant rain was coming. "I'd like that," I said. "Okay," he said. "Ryan." "Yeah. Fix the back gate when you come," I said. "The latch has been broken since March." A pause, then done. "I need to tell you what happened with Daniel Cross because the story is incomplete without it, and I owe you the complete version. His trial was 8 months later. I attended 2 days of it. Not all of it, because Carol advised me that extended attendance in a federal trial is less cathartic than people imagine and more exhausting than they prepare for, and she was right. But I attended the day the forgery evidence was formally entered, and I attended the day the verdict came back. Guilty on 6 of 7 counts. The 7th, a conspiracy charge related to a third party who was never conclusively tied to the scheme, was acquitted on the basis of insufficient evidence. His attorney celebrated this partial victory with the enthusiasm of someone who had been expecting a complete loss. The sentencing came down 3 months after that. 12 years federal, with restitution ordered to the extent that recoverable assets allowed. The offshore accounts, when fully liquidated through the legal process, yielded approximately 22 million of the 32 that had been moved. The remaining 10 was in instruments and shell entities complex enough that the full recovery remained uncertain. 22 million, not all of it, but a number that changed the shape of what the future could look like. The civil shareholder claim, the 15 million, was settled 6 months after the criminal verdict in a process I will not detail here because it involved more paperwork than I ever want to describe to anyone. The settlement figure reached against the acquisition company's insurance instruments, and the recovered assets was 13.5 million, not 15. close. I had never expected $15 million in my life. $13.5 million arriving in a wire transfer I watched happen from my kitchen table on an ordinary Thursday morning was so far outside anything I had ever conceptualized as belonging to me that I had to call Denise immediately just to say the number out loud to another human being. $13.5 million, I said. Denise was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. What are you going to do with the garden hose money? I laughed until I had to sit down. Yeah. Ryan's accounts were substantially restored through the asset recovery process. Not whole, not entirely. The complexity of what Daniel had moved and what could be retraced and what had already been spent through the shell company layers meant that the final number was lower than what he'd started with. But he was not ruined. He was, in the financial sense at least, still a wealthy man with the opportunity to rebuild from a position that most people would consider extraordinary. He was also, in every way that mattered more than money, in the process of becoming a different kind of person. That process was not fast or clean. He was not a changed man overnight. He had bad weeks where the guilt overwhelmed him, and he got quiet in that old way, the wall coming up. He had good weeks where he called just to talk and fixed the back gate like he'd promised and sat at my kitchen table eating dinner and talking about nothing important. Both kinds of weeks were real. Both kinds of weeks were him. Carol sent me a handwritten note after the criminal verdict. It was 3 sentences. It said, "You were steady when steadiness was hardest. That's rare. I hope you know it." I put it on my refrigerator with a magnet I've had since 1987. It's still there. Burke sent a formal letter of conclusion on the case, which is what attorneys do, and then he sent a second personal email that was 6 words. "It was a pleasure, Margaret. Take care." I liked him more for that than I had for all the 30 years of professional competence, which was already considerable. The thing about a crisis of this scale, the kind that takes everything apart and puts it back in a different order, is that it doesn't leave you unchanged. I know I'm supposed to say something about being stronger, about silver linings, about the things you learn when your life is broken open. And some of that is true. I did learn things. I am different in ways that are not reversible, but I also lost things I don't get back. 5 months of my son's life that happened on the wrong side of a wall someone built between us. The specific, uncomplicated ease of calling my son without wondering what was wrong. The version of our relationship that existed before I learned what it could look like when it was under siege. Those losses are real. Grief is real even inside a story that ends with justice and with the door finally opening when you put in your key. What I know, what I hold on to when I go back to that night on the porch steps, which I do more than I probably should, is this. He called. When it cracked, when the floor dissolved, when the thing he'd let himself believe turned out to be built on someone else's plan, he called me, not Vanessa, not Daniel. Not anyone from the new life he'd been building with its careful distances. He called his mother, and I answered. That's the thing no one could take, no matter how many documents they forged or accounts they drained or locks they changed. The number in his phone that he dialed when everything stopped making sense. That number was mine. It was always mine. The first Sunday after everything was formally concluded, Ryan came for dinner. Not a significant dinner. Not a celebration with reservations at somewhere expensive, not a marked occasion with speeches or formal acknowledgement of everything we'd been through. Just dinner. My kitchen, my table, whatever I felt like cooking. He showed up at 5 o'clock with a bottle of wine he'd chosen carefully. I could tell because he mentioned the vineyard and then immediately got self-conscious about mentioning it, which was new and endearing, in a way the old Ryan would have found embarrassing. And a paper bag from the bakery on Clement Street that contained a pie I hadn't asked for, but that turned out to be exactly what I would have chosen if I'd been asked. Peach, my favorite. He had remembered without being reminded. I noticed that. I let it count. He stood in my kitchen while I cooked, which was something he had stopped doing somewhere in the middle years, the years of getting too big for the spaces we'd shared, too successful for the ordinary rituals that had shaped him. He used to stand in whatever kitchen we were in and talk while I cooked. It was just a thing we did, and then it was a thing we didn't do anymore, so gradually that I hadn't been able to identify the moment it stopped. Now, he was standing in my kitchen again, leaning against the counter in that loose-limbed way he'd had since he was a teenager, glass of wine in hand, talking about something he'd read, a book, a specific argument in it about risk and decision-making that he disagreed with, and he was articulating why, with the focused precision that had always made him good at what he built. And I was half listening and half cooking and thinking, this is it. This is the thing that was missing. Not the calls, not the visits. This, the ease of it. You're not listening, he said. I'm listening, I said. You disagree with the author's premise that all risk aversion is rooted in fear. You think risk aversion can also be rooted in experience. A pause. Okay, you were listening. I'm always listening, I said. You just forgot that for a while. He was quiet for a moment, then quietly, yeah, I did. I didn't make it into a thing. I just turned the heat down on the stove and let the moment be what it was. A small, honest acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't need amplification. The kind that means more because it isn't performed. We ate at my kitchen table and the conversation moved the way good conversation moves, without agenda, without destination, doubling back on itself, following whatever thread was interesting. He told me about the therapist, Dr. Reyes, who had apparently said something in their third session that had reoriented how Ryan understood his relationship to achievement, and which he'd been turning over ever since. He didn't tell me exactly what she'd said. Some things belonged to the room they're said in, but he told me enough that I understood its shape. She asked me what I was trying to prove, he said, not to the world, to myself. And I gave her this whole answer about building something real, something that mattered, something that would last. And she just waited until I was done. And then she said, who were you building it for? He turned his wine glass slowly on the table. I didn't have a good answer. What did you say? I said for myself. And she said, are you sure? Because most of the choices you're describing sound like they were built for an audience. He paused. I thought about you, about the $40,000, about how that wasn't for an audience. It was just you believing in me in a room with nobody watching. I looked at my son across the table, 32 years old, with his father's heart and my stubbornness and a mind that had always moved faster than the world around it, sitting in my kitchen eating peach pie and telling me something true. That's right, I said. It was just me believing in you. I lost track of that, he said. Of who was watching versus who actually cared. You found it again, I said. He looked at me. Did I? You're here, I said, on a Sunday, with peach pie. That's finding it. He almost smiled. The real one, the one that starts slow. That's a low bar, Mom. It's the right bar, I said. It's the only bar that was ever real. I want to tell you something now that is harder to say than the events of what happened. Harder than the locks or the forgery or the FBI office or the 12-year sentence. It's the thing underneath all of it, the thing that was true before Daniel Cross existed and will be true long after his name fades from my memory. I was not a perfect mother. I need to say that clearly, because the version of the story where I was the unblemished victim and Ryan was simply corrupted by outside forces is not the full truth. The full truth is more complicated, and complexity is where the real lesson lives. I worked so hard for so long, and I was so focused on making sure Ryan had everything he needed that I sometimes forgot to let him know that what I needed from him was not achievement, was not success, was not repayment. There were times when I held up his accomplishments like proof of my own worth as a parent, and I didn't always separate my love for him from my pride in what he could do. I didn't always make it clear enough, not just in words but in the texture of daily life, that he was enough without the grades and the laptop and the company and the $300 million. He grew up watching me sacrifice. He internalized sacrifice as the language of love. And then, when he finally had enough money to stop sacrificing, he didn't know what love looked like without it. He didn't know how to receive it without cost attached. Vanessa walked into that gap. Daniel walked into that gap. They didn't create the gap. They found it and they used it. I am not letting either of them off the hook for a single thing they did. What they did was criminal and calculated and deliberately cruel in the specific way that targets people who have worked their whole lives for what little they have. But I am also honest enough to say that in the architecture of how Ryan became vulnerable to them, my fingerprints are there too. Not maliciously, not even consciously, but there, Doctor. Reyes said something to Ryan that he told me about several weeks after that first Sunday dinner, when we'd gotten into a rhythm of talking more honestly than we had in years. She had said that the wounds we carry from childhood are not always dramatic. Sometimes the wound is simply being loved conditionally without knowing it, because the condition was something good. Achievement, excellence, forward motion, and good conditions feel like encouragement rather than pressure until suddenly they don't. I sat with that for a long time. I don't fully agree with all of it, but I hold it honestly, because you can't fix what you won't look at. Ryan and I talked about it directly, eventually. Not that first Sunday, and not easily, and not in a single conversation. It happened across several months in pieces, the way real reckonings happen. Not in the cathartic, single conversation that movies would give you, but in an accumulation of smaller, harder moments where both people have to stay in the room even when the room gets uncomfortable. He told me things that hurt to hear. I told him things that cost me something to say. We had one conversation in particular on a Thursday afternoon in October, sitting on my back porch with the garden going gold around us, where he said something that I need to share because I think it's the most important sentence in this entire story. He said, "I needed you to want me, not just need me." And I understood exactly what he meant, and I understood exactly where I had failed him there. And I told him so without qualification and without self-defense, because he deserved that. And then I told him, "I have always wanted you. I just didn't always know how to show you that, separate from everything else." He nodded. He looked at the garden. After a while he said, "We could have talked about this. Before everything happened, we should have." "Yes," I said, "we should have." Why didn't we? I thought about it honestly, because it was easier to talk about the surface things, the company, the money, how things were going. The deep things are harder to start. "Yeah," he said, "we sat in the garden for another hour after that, mostly in silence, and it was the most comfortable silence I'd shared with my son in years. The productive kind of silence, where two people are both chewing on something real and don't need words to know the other person is still there." The money changed things, and I want to be honest about that too. Not in the ways you might expect. I didn't buy a new house or a new car or anything dramatic. What I did was, first, pay off every remaining debt I had, which was not much, but which had been a low-grade background hum for so many years that its absence felt almost strange. Then I gave a significant amount to Denise. Not as repayment, because you can't put a price on someone who drives to a parking lot at 10:30 at night and picks you up off someone else's porch steps, but because she had spent 30 years being my person and she deserved to have some ease in her life. She argued with me. I won. She cried a little. I pretended not to notice. I funded a scholarship at the technical university Ryan had attended. Anonymous, small enough to be sustainable, large enough to matter. Specifically for first-generation students from single-parent households in STEM fields, the kind of thing that might have helped Ryan if it had existed when he needed it. I did not tell him about this for 6 months. When I did, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, "That's exactly the right thing." And I could tell he meant it in a way that went below the surface. The rest, the bulk of it, I put somewhere safe, managed by an attorney Carol recommended. Someone with a track record she'd verified herself, and an investment philosophy that prioritized boring security over exciting returns. I sleep fine at night with boring security. I spent too many years without it to undervalue it now. Ryan rebuilt his financial life carefully, with the particular meticulousness of someone who had learned the hard way what carelessness costs. He hired new advisors, 2 of them, deliberately creating oversight rather than the single point of control that Daniel had occupied. He had Carol review every financial arrangement for the first year. He was, by his own admission, overcautious in a way that sometimes frustrated him, and he talked about that with Dr. Reyes, and she apparently said something useful that he didn't fully share with me, but that resulted in him gradually relaxing into a more sustainable middle ground. He did not start another company immediately. He took nearly a year before he began anything new, which was unprecedented for someone who had been building things since he was 14. He told me he needed to know who he was when he wasn't in the middle of building something. I thought that was the wisest thing I'd ever heard him say, and I told him so. He started something new in the spring, a smaller operation this time, a cybersecurity consulting firm that works specifically with non-profit organizations and municipal government agencies that couldn't afford the enterprise-grade protections that corporations took for granted. Not a $300 million idea, more like a $42 check idea. Specific, careful, useful, built for someone who needed it rather than for someone who could pay the most for it. The first time he told me about a client they'd helped, a small city in the Midwest whose water treatment systems had been probed by a ransomware group, and how Ryan's team had identified and closed the vulnerability before anything was compromised. His face had an expression on it that I hadn't seen since the back bedroom in Austin. The still bright expression, the light that stops flickering when it's finally getting enough power. Not because of the money, because of the thing itself. He had found his way back to why he started. There are things from that period that I carry differently now than I did when I was in the middle of them. The night on the porch steps, which felt, while it was happening, like one of the worst nights of my life, I now think of as the night everything stopped being slow. There is a kind of suffering that creeps, that moves so gradually you don't notice you're in the middle of it until you're very deep in. The distance between Ryan and me had crept. Daniel's plan had crept. Vanessa's management of my son's perception of himself and his past had crept. Everything had happened slowly enough that I had repeatedly talked myself out of trusting what I felt. Then the key didn't turn, and everything that had been creeping stopped creeping and started being undeniable. There is something almost useful about a crisis that forces clarity. I am not grateful for what happened. I want to be precise about that. I am not one of those people who believes that suffering is inherently instructive, that pain always contains a lesson worth the price of admission. Sometimes suffering is just suffering. But in this particular case, in this particular story, the crisis that Daniel cross-engineered to rob us ended up being the thing that cracked open a wall between me and my son that we'd both been maintaining in different ways for years. He didn't know that. I'm sure he didn't factor it in. He looked at our family and saw disconnection that could be exploited, and he exploited it. He couldn't have anticipated that the disconnection itself would become the thing that galvanized us. People who prey on families assume the damage is already done. They don't account for what happens when the family decides it isn't. I went back through my journal recently, the one I started keeping after the certified letter arrived, the one where I wrote dates and facts, and the occasional feeling when the feeling was too large to just carry. And I read the entry from the night I sat on the porch steps. It's short. I hadn't written much that night for obvious reasons. But the last line of it says, I don't know what comes next, but I know who I am and I know what's mine. I don't remember writing it. I remember sitting on those steps and feeling the specific texture of the wood through my clothes and listening to the moths around the porch light. I don't remember what I was thinking that produced that sentence, but when I read it now, I think, yes, that was always true. The whole time it was true. The key not turning, the accounts drained, the signature forged, none of it changed what was true underneath. I knew who I was, and I knew what was mine. Not just the house, not just the 15%, 5% that had compounded legally and morally into something much larger. What was mine was the relationship. The 32 years of it, imperfect and interrupted and resumed. The library books and the casserole in the oven and the $40,000 and the 14-hour drives and the Sunday dinners and the back porch conversations that cost both of us something to have and were worth every cent. That was mine. It was always mine. I see. Denise asked me once. This was maybe 4 months after everything concluded. During one of the Saturday mornings, we'd reinstated as a formal habit, coffee at my kitchen table, no agenda. She asked me, "Do you forgive him?" I knew she meant Ryan, not Daniel, not Vanessa, Ryan. The person whose choices had created the opening that everything else walked through. I thought about it seriously, not for show. I genuinely sat with the question. I think forgiveness is something people talk about like it's a single event, I said finally. Like there's a moment where you decide and then it's done. But it's not like that, at least not for me. It's more like every day I decide again. Some days it's easy. Some days something will remind me of those 5 months and it'll be harder. Denise was quiet in the way that means she's listening rather than waiting to speak. But the choosing, I continued. The choosing to stay, to keep showing up, to have the Thursday conversation on the porch even when it costs something, that's forgiveness. Not as a feeling, as a practice. Do you trust him? She asked. That was the harder question. Differently than before, I said. Not less. Just with more clarity about what trust actually means. It doesn't mean assuming nothing will go wrong. It means believing that when something does, we'll both stay in the room. She nodded slowly. And do you believe that? I do, I said, because we already proved it. We stayed in the room when it was the hardest possible room to stay in. She picked up her coffee, looked at me over the rim in the way she's looked at me for 30 years, which is the look of someone who has watched you at your worst and your most ordinary and every shade in between and decided to stay anyway. You know, she said, most people don't get to rebuild something that broke that completely. I know, I said. You're lucky, she said. I know that too, I said. She put her coffee down. Outside my back window, the October garden was doing its quiet autumn thing, going to gold and amber, and the particular exhausted beauty of a thing that has grown all it's going to grow this season and is now preparing to rest. For the record, Denise said, I never doubted you for a second. You told me I needed a lawyer before I told myself I needed a lawyer, I said. That's because I'm smarter than you. You're more decisive than me, I said. There's a difference. She almost choked on her coffee. And we laughed, real laughter, the kind that has no agenda, the kind that happens between two people who have been through enough together that the relief of ordinary joy feels like a specific gift rather than a default state. Gamdi. I want to say something directly now to anyone who is listening to the story and recognizing something in it. Maybe you felt the thing I felt, that creeping awareness that something is wrong with someone you love, paired with the terrible habit of talking yourself out of your own instincts, because doubt feels more polite than alarm. I talked myself out of what I knew for 5 months. 5 months of excuses and explanations and generous interpretations of behavior that did not deserve generosity. I am here to tell you, trust the joint ache. Trust the thing your body knows before your mind wants to admit it. I'm not saying catastrophize. I'm not saying panic at every unfamiliar change in the people you love. But when something persistent and specific is telling you that something is off, when you have a feeling that lives in your chest rather than your head, that has been there for weeks and doesn't resolve no matter how many times you explain it away, listen to it. Get in your car and ask the question directly. Hire the attorney. Open the folder. The worst that happens is you were wrong and you had an uncomfortable conversation. I would take 1,000 uncomfortable conversations over 5 months of shrinking myself to avoid one. And to anyone who has been the Ryan in the story, who has let someone build a wall between you and the person who loved you without conditions, who has let the language of growth be used to justify abandonment, who has signed things without reading them and called it trust, I am not here to condemn you. I am here to say that the wall is not permanent, it can come down. It takes work that is harder than building it was, and it takes a willingness to stay in rooms that are uncomfortable and it takes the practice of choosing every single day, even when the choice costs something, but it can come down. And the thing on the other side of it, if you're lucky, is still there, waiting, a little tired, a little hurt, holding a folder of documents it kept for 30 years on the instinct that they might matter someday, still answering when you call.
That time,
on the first anniversary of the night on the porch steps, Ryan came over in the evening, not because we'd planned it as a commemoration. Neither of us had said out loud that we knew what the date was. But I suspect we both did. I suspect he chose that Sunday to come the same way I happened to have dinner already made when he arrived. Because some things don't need to be said to be understood between two people who know each other. We ate, we talked, we sat on the back porch after, in the cooling September evening, with what was left of the wine and the specific quiet of a house that has been a home long enough that it knows how to hold silence without making it awkward. He fixed the back gate the way he'd promised. He'd done it months ago, properly, with new hardware he'd driven to the hardware store to select himself. Every time I use it now, I think about that, not dramatically. Just a small recognition each time of the fact that he said he would do something, and then he did it. That's what trust looks like rebuilt. Small things, repeated, no audience. At some point in the evening, when the sky had gone from blue to the deep grey blue that precedes full dark, Ryan said, "I drove past the Austin condo last month. I looked at him. He'd sold it months ago, moved somewhere smaller and less statement-making, somewhere that was a home rather than an accessory." And I said, "And nothing," he said. "It just looked like a building. I don't know what I expected." He paused. "I think I thought I'd feel something, but it was a building." "Because that's what it was," I said, "a building. The life you were living inside it is what you were really looking for." He turned to look at me, "And the life I was living inside it was not yours," I said simply. He was quiet for a moment, then, "No, it wasn't." The garden was dark now, the rosemary invisible but present in the smell of the air, and the porch light was on above us. My porch light, the one with the slightly crooked fixture I still hadn't fixed, and its light fell around both of us in that particular warm, imprecise way that porch lights do, too warm to be practical and too human to be anything else. "Mom," Ryan said. "Yeah." He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the dark garden like he was reading something in it. Then, "Thank you for not giving up on me when I was being someone I shouldn't have been." I looked at my son. This person I had made by accident and design, and 32 years of daily choosing. This person who had cost me more than almost anything and been worth every cent. "Ryan," I said, "I was always going to be on your side, even when you weren't on mine. That's not something I needed to decide. It was just always true." "That's not fair to you," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. "Sometimes it wasn't. I should have been on yours." "Yes," I said, "you should have." "I am now," he said. "I know," I said, "I can tell." We sat there until the wine was gone and the night was full, and the porch light did its warm, imprecise, slightly crooked job of keeping the dark a little further back than it would otherwise be. That's what it does, a porch light. It doesn't change what's out there in the dark. It just tells you where home is, so you can find your way back. It was on when I was locked out. It was on when I came back. It's on now, every night, in the house that is mine and has always been mine, with the slightly crooked fixture I've decided to stop planning to fix. Some things you learn to love in their imperfection. Some things you realize were never broken. They were just waiting for you to come home and see them clearly. The fortune didn't define us. The lesson did. And the lesson was this: the people who love you without conditions are the most valuable thing you will ever have, and the worst thing you can do with a fortune is use it to forget that. Don't forget it. Don't wait until the key won't turn.